following panel is part of the Comics Arts Conference. The CAC is an academic conference that takes place every year at WonderCon and the San Diego Comic-Con. Our mission is to bring academics and professionals together with the public to discuss the medium that we all love. Because of its academic focus, CIC programming is a little different from other con programming. We hope you enjoy it. You can find more information about the CAC, including how to apply to present at future meetings, at our website at comicsartsconference.wp.txstate.edu.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second and hopefully last virtual Comic-Con at home. Today we're doing a panel on comics in museums. This is a topic I think a lot of people like. If you're a comic fan of comic art, a lot of the time you'll be looking at stuff and say, this piece belongs in a museum. And, you know, especially if you've come of age, you know, in the age bracket that we all are in, that was a long process getting comics to the level of acceptance and appreciation in the art world, and bringing the level of criticism and having comics art being taken seriously as a medium was a long and involved process. It was the subject of a really terrific book by Kim Munson, who will be on the panel here. This is called Comic Art in Museums, came out last year. My name is Rob Salkowitz. I am proud to be a contributor to that book. I am a writer and sayer of things about comics in places like Forbes, ICV2, and Publishers Weekly, and I teach at the University of Washington. It is my real pleasure to have this assemblage of talent here. I'd like to go around the horn and ask you to quickly introduce yourselves. Let's start with Diana.
Hi, I'm Diana Green. I teach writing and comic history at Minneapolis College of Art and Design. And a couple of years ago, one of my comics was actually translated into Russian, so yay me. Moving on.
Very cool. Eric, how about you?
Hi, I'm Eric Boime. I'm a professor of popular culture and environmental history at San Diego State University.
Kim?
Me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Kim Munson. I'm the editor of Comic Art in Museums, and all of these nice people contributed to the book. I have a master's from San Francisco State University and just love writing about comics and researching. And I have a exhibition, Women in Comics, that just opened in Rome and will going on to Naples as part of the Naples Comic-Con and the Art Festival in Rome.
Very cool. Charles.
I'm Charles Hatfield, professor of English at California State University Northridge, or CSUN, and a committed comics scholar. I love writing about the form, and I had the pleasure of curating a Jack Kirby exhibition for the Cal State Northridge Art Galleries in 2015.
Excellent. Mr. Duffy, sir.
Hi, I'm Damian Duffy. I'm a lecturer at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign School of Information Sciences. I'm also a cartoonist and graphic novelist. And my most recent work is a graphic novel adaptation of Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler with artist John Jennings.
Very cool. And last but certainly not least, Denis Kitchen.
Hi, yeah, I've been in the comics industry forever, mostly as a publisher and cartoonist, but I think I'm here today because I've curated a few comic art exhibitions.
Excellent. So
Dennis was also a real mentor to me on the book.
We have all, you know, I think written about this. I started writing about this in a piece actually for Full Bleed, for IDW's Full Bleed, on called Splashing Ink on Museum Walls, which is a piece that was included. And then I've also written a lot about the art market in Forbes and places like that, because a lot of the times, frankly, the attention follows the money. But to kick off and give us sort of a historical overview of what's going on with this, Kim, why don't you tell us your perspective on this, what you were up to with the book, and where we're going on this discussion.
Okay, well, I'm going to share my screen to show there's a lot of images in my book. So I'm gonna, here we go. This book actually came out last year in July, right before Comic-Con. And we were supposed to do this panel last year at Comic-Con live in person. But they were nice and let us postpone. And now here we are. Who expected this to go on for so long? One of the concepts that I point out in the book is sort of the evolution that exhibits have gone through. So far, I've researched back to like 1930. And, you know, exhibits were like kind of hasty, pasted up, like, you know, this is a Milt Caniff show that toured for a long time. You probably can't see the detail in it, but they're like strips that are laminated, you know, and they were sent from museum to museum, and they'd show them for like a weekend or a week and then send it on to the next place. And, you know, exhibits weren't like such a big investment. The next picture is a show that was in 1972 that toured like the West Coast. You can see that it's done like sort of in the traditional museum manner with the, you know, everything all hanging at eye level and nice blow ups and all of that stuff. And newer shows now think a lot more about design, and there's a lot of different creative ways of showing stuff. There's a lot of new media that's involved, you know, with like iPads and different ways to message to the audience what's there. There's videos, etc. So exhibits have really, really changed a lot. In the book, I have sections about the foundations of comics, like, you know, or not comics, but like exhibitions, like, you know, how comics work as an art object and who the pioneers were and stuff like that. I've got a section on pioneers of comics that includes the first international show in Brazil, and this fabulous show at the Louvre in 1967 and other breakthrough shows. I try to incorporate a lot of international shows. There's an article about comics in Japan. There's one about comics in Dubai. There are a lot of sections from France and the UK. But, you know, I just tried to like give kind of an overview of sort of the state of it now and how it got there and what the exhibition, like the ways that people have found to like kind of respect comics as a sequential medium and keep the narrative in there, but still, you know, have it not be too overwhelming for the audience. Except if you're talking about like Crumb's Genesis and you show the whole 200 pages. But you can see here, there's a lot of ways that exhibits are shown, and it was a real exploration. I had great help from everybody, all the contributors, all the museums that I asked for images. Also, I'd like to just express my gratitude to Dr. Tom Ng, who recently passed, who was a real champion for my book at Mississippi Press and wrote the foreword. That's it for me for now.
Terrific. And as these shows indicate, you know, it's because comics is not only a visual art, it's also a narrative art. There's issues of storytelling. There is a popular art, it engages its audience differently from comics. It's no wonder that it took the critical language a while to establish this kind of vocabulary about how do we talk about comics, how do we think about comics. Eric, your father was one of the earliest people to help codify that language and put a stake in the ground in terms of how do we talk about this, how do we treat it critically.
Thank you, Rob. I'm going to keep it short though, because I am not discussing my own scholarship, but as Rob says, I'm talking about my dad's contribution, and he passed away in 2008, but he would have just been overjoyed to see his work republished in your book, Kim. So thank you so much for doing that. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about his legacy, even though admittedly, though I am a tenured professor, I'm probably the least knowledgeable, even though I have an avid love of comic books. I'm in nowhere. I can't compete with the rest of your guys' knowledge. I do remember that exhibit, by the way, on Kirby, and it was amazing, Charles. Anyways, this essay that my dad wrote about was published 50 years ago. So like all scholarship published 50 years ago, a lot of the things that were said are pretty basic today. A lot of the paradigms are outdated. It was also contextualized by what was going on in 1972 in the height of the Vietnam War. And, my dad's anger over that war really informed his own look at the violence in comic strips, and also his contempt for the Sunday funnies in the post-war era, post-World War era that was sanitized and apolitical. And I should also say that other disciplines we're also talking about popular culture and art. As your own pictures show, Kim, it wasn't exactly radical in 1972 to say that Superman deserved as much scrutiny as the Sistine Chapel. However, art history was not one of those fields. They were really behind the curve in a lot of ways. It was still primarily white and Eurocentric. It was influenced by very wealthy, the field was by very rich patrons of the arts and institutions that really considered fine art to be fine art, and everything, all the rest was commercialized vulgarity. Still, in 1972, it was an impressive achievement for him to print this article, to put this article out in art history. It was rather unprecedented to put it out in such a rigorous journal. Mm-hmm. And to break into this world of art history, he had to make the case, Al had to make the case that comic strips were not just a form of art. Again, this was a given. Rather, he had to illustrate that the origins and its disseminations was intimately associated with the development of modern art. Modern art used techniques that were pioneered by comic strip artists, and at the same time, artists were avid consumers of the comic strips. They were outspoken advocates, outspoken fans, and obviously that consumption impacted their craft. So Al grounded the American comic strip in the post-Civil War era. And this is when every newspaper began to have their own art department. And that was because illustrative journalism, particularly editorial cartooning, was widely popular. It really drove up sales in the newspapers. And it was no coincidence that all the pioneering comic strip artists were editorial cartoonists. Not all, but most of them. And these art departments, they worked as if they were the academies in Europe or graduate school for a lot of artists who wanted nothing more than to see their work in print. So at the same time that comic strips were influenced by editorial cartoonists, the first appearance of these comic strips also occurred simultaneously with the Ashcan School, which was America's first modern movement in painting. And this movement, the Ashcan School, was famous for showing the grittier side of urban life. And that's what so was the case with the first cartoons in the first quarter of the 20th century. Among one of the luminaries of the Ashcan School was not the curator, but the one who took over for the Yellow Kid comic strip, which was the seminal strip that of the Pulitzer's newspaper. But this influence happened in many other ways. The fortunes of contemporary art, and how it overlapped with the comic strip. Picasso, for example, he was an outspoken fan of the Castle-Jammer Kids, and you could see his influence in such works as his Dream and Lie of Franco. Night Fishing at Thebes in 1939 definitely seemed to be influenced by Alley-Oop. which was also appropriated by other modern artists. The same could be said with the futurist movement and their emphasis on lines of force. And these lines of force were these lines that were radiated out of their objects to show vibrations and physical impact. And obviously this was common fare. The comic strips I show you here with these lines of motion were formed in 1912, and that was the same time where Marcel Duchamp pioneered this painting, Nude Descending Down a Staircase, in 1912. That was the same year. And I know this Charles Schulz comic strip occurred 30 years later, but it still, I thought, very illustrative of the way in which comic strips and artists spoke to each other. Ruth Goldberg's inventions obviously influenced Dadaism, and soon, by the 60s, comic strips actually became subject material. This is the case in which, Jasper John's abstract expressionist painting, I don't know if you can see it from here, which was he famously recreated an alley-oop strip. But more importantly, more popularly, I would say, comics became the subjects of pop artists like Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein. And of course, these may have been employed ironically, but this is the fact remained by the fact that they put these subjects into their paintings. They elevated so-called fine art. They elevated comic strips into the realm of fine art, and simultaneously, my dad noted, they demoted fine art to the level of the comic strip. So, in conclusion, artists were obviously nurtured, by the visual developments of the comic strip. And as a result, to quote my father, the comic strip had every right to be embraced by art history. Thank you.
So this was, groundbreaking discourse in art history in the 1970s. And I think, Eric, that your father did amazing work sort of building up this scaffolding that connects, the sort of degraded, less prestigious commercial art form of comics with, this ivory tower of fine art. One place where I think that the intentions of comic artists are a little bit more intelligible to the art world, came into focus in the 1980s when you had, work that was being done in, sort of outsider art and lowbrow, crossing over to underground alternative comics, which were a form of personal expression less than a commercial medium. Diana, you did some scholarship around a seminal exhibit in the late 80s, early 90s, I guess, that made this explicit. You should unmute.
There I am. Hi. Yeah, I only have the one image, and let me begin by apologizing for the blasphemy of an empty bookshelf behind me. My books are in storage. We're rebuilding. So anyway, business at hand. 1991 to 1992, there was a touring exhibit that was put out by Fantagraphics called Misfit Lit. It opened in Seattle, I just have the dates here, in March of 91 and closed in Seattle of May 92. It played Winnipeg in July of 1992 and was in Minneapolis from December 7th of 91 to January 25th of 92. The early 90s in comics were going through a period of actual recognition as opposed to, gosh, well, comics aren't just for kids anymore. This was the era when Vertigo was blooming. There were new issues of Sandman. I think Alan Moore was actually still writing. It was a vibrant time, and it was a time when it was not just considered cool, but intelligent to read comics again. And in this environment, Fantagraphics did this touring exhibit that was built largely, but not exclusively, around contemporary Fantagraphic artists. Willis was in there, there's some Charles Burns, but there were also Hogarth pieces, Schultz pieces, it was a panorama of comic book history. There was some Frank King in there. There was some Jim Woodring, who at the time was just starting to really break in. The first issue of Hyena came out, I want to say 1990. But what they did with it, what was interesting was, in addition to touring different segments of it to different cities, they had the local venues incorporate and collate local artists and regional artists. So in Minneapolis, in addition to S. Clay Wilson and Schultz, we got Reed Waller and Bill Fugit and Tim Fay and a local editorial cartoonist named Pete Wagner, who at the time I thought was kind of a doof, but turned out to be okay. And a phenomenal piece by Linda Berry, who was local to Minneapolis at the time. This was a painting that was about 3 feet by 4 feet of a woman who was trying to recover from abuse and having a dialogue with herself about it, cowered in a fetal position and buried at the bottom of the image. And the image was dominated 3/4 by the dialogue. First time I met Linda in San Diego, about 6 years ago, I think it was, I mentioned how much I liked her large painting, and she said, I've never did a large painting. Don't you remember Misfit Lit? Oh, that. Yeah, I had to do that one at that size, but I don't want to talk about it any more than that. So I let it go because that's what you do. The exhibit ran from December 7th through January 25th. And they did different things in different neighborhoods. In Seattle, they actually did a play based on a Charles Burns story. The Winnipeg exhibition did something with local artists actually doing a live jam during one of the openings. And there was a massive panel discussion at the Minneapolis one, which has been archived on YouTube. And you can watch it in chunks. It's pretty interesting to see S. Clay Wilson and Kate Worley exchange ideas on censorship. Let me see if I can do this thing real quick here. This is the Burns poster for the exhibition. Artifacts was one of about a half dozen galleries in the warehouse district in Minneapolis. What happened in Minneapolis in the late 80s, early 90s is much like what Reed Waller and Kate Worley wrote about in Omaha. There was a big political corruption fight over what was going on downtown. And in the course of that fight, downtown Minneapolis, they had made a massive attempt to homogenize it with the advent of the Target Center as a new basketball venue and entertainment venue. And they got rid of a lot of the strip clubs, dive bars, and art galleries, the smaller art galleries, in favor of the more prestigious. Artiflex was up one rickety flight of stairs with a shaky handrail and weirdly lit. The rooms were this pale yellow color. The artwork was hung with great love, but the room did not lend itself to solid presentation. I managed to see the show twice before it left, and I was grateful the second time because I pretty much had the place to myself because it was January in Minnesota. And it was a particularly cold January. I've been to a fair number of comic shows since then, but I don't think I've encountered anything quite like this. This was a singular experience. Let's see if I can get out of this here. Stop share, there it is. Okay, I think that's a good place to stop on that one. Thank you.
Yeah. And I, on the subject of Misfit Lit, I'd like to call out the person who actually was behind that and put that together is a guy named Larry Reed out here in Seattle, who has curated that show. He's kind of an instigator between the art and literary world and music world. He currently runs the Fantagraphics store out here. As you may know, there was a little bit of music going on in Seattle in the early 90s as well. And he was instrumental in sort of bringing together those subcultures and elevating this comic show into the mass consciousness in that way. And I didn't know that it had gone on tour, but I had also seen it in those days too. And it was
That was Fantagraphics' mission then, was to elevate comics. And I think they put their money where their mouths were between Comics Journal and some of their early published works, like Dalgota.
So I think that in those days, in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, this battle was fought and won to get comic art on the walls. But then the later questions became, whose work are we going to show, and how are we going to show it, and how are we going to represent, the vast scope of who's doing comics, and how do we sort that stuff out. And I want to move the conversation over to Damian to talk about some of your impressions and experiences in that realm.
Yeah, so my first foray into curating comics art began with my frequent collaborator, John Jennings, and it began as a reaction to the Masters of American Comics exhibition, which, created a canon of 12 masters in a very sort of traditional fine art museum style. And it was, when we first learned about it, the fact that it was all women and accepting George Harriman, all white men. I'm sorry, all men, all white men, except for George Harriman. We felt like that was kind of an unnecessary part of the conversation, or that establishing a canon of like the greats was a very sort of old-fashioned way to approach comics, and tended to sort of encapsulate comics as very done almost. Here's you start with early newspapers, you get to alternative comics, we've encapsulated it for you. Here are the greats. So we ended up wanting to curate a show in like the exact opposite direction, so an anti-canon, something that was very much about portraying the sheer diversity of voices in comics, of types of comics, and of presentation materials of comics. So we ended up doing an exhibition called Out of Sequence at the Kreiner Art Museum in Champaign, Illinois in 2008. And it was called, the subtitle for it was Underrepresented Voices in American Comics. And we took underrepresentation to mean two different things. So demographic underrepresentation, so LGBTQ creators, women creators, creators of color, but also underrepresented in terms of kind of the formal aspects of comics and what people tended to think comics could or could not do. So including things like abstract comics, gallery comics, virtual reality comics, things like that. And this was when I really began to think of comics as old new media, in that there's a lot of research into literacy and multimodal literacy that looks at comics as a good way to sort of train the mind to be a critically literate reader of other media, of digital media, because of both the visual and the juxtapositional nature of the medium. And this sort of observation, coupled with the fact that I was busy curating the show, led me to think of curating comics as a new media art exhibition. And there were a lot of strands in new media exhibition that seemed to fit very well with comics, even though it's, from either the 19th century or cave paintings, depending on where you want to draw the line. I think that one aspect of new media curation that fit really well with comics was, of course, the visual nature, but also the kind of breaking down the binary of high and low art, of making it okay to have narrative in art, because comics is so much about narrative. Even abstract comics, I mean, they play on the idea that it's about narrative. So thinking about the museum space less as kind of this mausoleum of the great original works of the masters, and more as this new media space where we could tell kind of an abstract narrative about the sort of many threads in this broad tapestry of comics that is still very much vibrant and alive. And that's curatorial work John and I have continued in different ways with a couple of art books called Black Comics. But I do have some images from the Out of Sequence show that I think kind of clarify this sort of new media discussion. So we wanted to sort of mix up where you would normally see these comics. So we have web comics that we printed out and put on the wall as prints. We were projecting art from print comics like as digital. And then we also see it better in another image. So we had art. This was from the 70s. We have Trina Robbins here. So we did some historical art, but also showing its original sort of print context because it's a print medium. And then we would also had prints hung in the gallery a bit off the wall to give sort of a three-dimensional sense and kind of put forward this idea that like you're almost walking into a comic. And this was very much inspired by John and I had done some work making these virtual reality 3D comics in a virtual space the museum had. And we sort of wanted to bring that to the gallery walls as well. And we also used Blue Line to sort of section off different parts of the exhibition. You can see here, they were also sort of off the wall to reference the process of comics also. Because, you know, capitalism hides process. Stole that one from John, he always says that one. But it's very much a part of and an interest in, I think, showing a comics exhibition is seeing like those stages the work goes through. And showing that lots of people do it in lots of different ways. So we had like a time lapse of coloring process on a newer piece. We had some original art with the notes on it, such as these. I think that's E. Sims Campbell. And then we had sort of art made in a fine art context. I cannot remember that artist's name right now. There were 50 some artists, and it's been many years. But then also we had like more sort of newer, slick digital art done for online spaces. So again, just sort of taking this idea of comics, thinking of it as a new media, thinking of it as something that is sort of just now coming to its own, especially in an art museum context, and sort of pushing the boundaries of what makes sense to do in an exhibition, and you know, what kind of conversations do you want to come out of exhibiting this medium in this, for comics, relatively new space. And yeah, so there you go. Oh, and this piece here, the Mark Staff Brandel gallery comic, I'll end on that because it's kind of a telling story. He did this piece on the wall, but also these small oil paintings on a cardboard made to look like comic covers and put in a magazine rack. And part of the exhibition traveled to Boulder, Colorado. And at the opening of that show, people actually took some of those because they were under the impression that they were there to take because they were comics and in a magazine rack, when in fact they were stealing paintings from a gallery. And it turned out, this was a smaller gallery, it turned out people from, I think, the Denver Art Museum, who like should have known better, were among those who like took some of them. So just sort of showing how comics is still sort of in a liminal space inside a gallery and figuring out like what comics are for in a gallery. I thought that incident really sort of highlights how, is this interactive? Is this not? You know, that sort of overlap between comics and new media. And I think that's all I have.
Right, that's the whole question, right? Because when you put comics on a wall in a museum, you know, you're asking people to contemplate them like in their pictorial dimension, in their narrative dimension, but you also have to acknowledge that there's a cultural impact to the spectacular imagery, and there's an intimate experience to reading the comics to yourself. Charles, I think you've explored this not only in the realm of theory, but also in the realm of practice. You know, at the two poles of those, the spectacular nature of probably the most spectacular guy to ever work in comics, Jack Kirby, and also talking about the sort of intimacy of experiencing the work of Robert Crumb in a public space as opposed to in the privacy of your, you know, reading room or something. Why don't you talk a little bit about some of the work that you contributed to this?
Thank you. I was privileged to contribute 2 essays to the book, one as a reviewer and one as a curator. So as a reviewer, I wrote about the Robert Crumb Genesis exhibition as it was exhibited at the Hammer Museum in 2010. And that piece was first published on my blog. And then as a curator, I wrote a personal reflection or curator's statement about the Jack Kirby exhibition Comic Book Apocalypse, which I curated for the Cal State Northridge Art Galleries in 2015. That piece was originally written for John Morrow's magazine, the Jack Kirby Collector. The book also contains 2 other pieces that relate to the Kirby exhibition by critics Doug Harvey and Alexi Worth. So it's a real privilege to have two different sides of my experience as a gallery goer and then again as a curator represented in the book. And I've been trying to figure out what those things have in common, what those writings or those records of experience have in common. And I've really been worrying over the issue of readability of comics in the gallery space, which I think you were alluding to, Robin, which Damian, I think you theorized very nicely in the essay that's included in the book, the essay on remastering American comics, where you talk about the different worlds of comics, that there's the world of the readable handheld, narrative object. And then again, there's the world of spectacle and exhibitry, as you put it, Rob, trying to display the work to best advantage within the gallery space. And so those two things sort of being, I don't want to say in conflict, but in a tension with one another, that's still a part of my experience of this question of comics in museums and galleries. So I'll just screen share a few images. This is the opening of the Crumb Genesis exhibition as it appeared at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. All 200 plus pages of Crumb's book of Genesis Illustrated were on view, all on a level and all in a row. So it was a very Spartan uniform kind of exhibit in terms of its exhibitry. And people did try to read the first few pages dutifully, I noticed. And after that, they just began to run out of steam, and then they would skim through the work more quickly. So this is one way to display a really long and extended narrative work in comics, right? In the Kirby exhibition, and I hope you're seeing a slide of that on your screen now, we actually included two complete Jack Kirby stories, though you can't tell that from these photos. One was a Marvel comic from the late 60s, an issue of Thor, plotted and penciled by Kirby, dialogued and edited by Stan Lee, and mostly inked by Vince Colletta. The other was an issue of Kirby's DC comic Commandy, The Last Boy on Earth, from about 5 years later in the early mid-70s, and that was solely written and drawn by Kirby under his own editorship and inked by Mike Royer. And one of my favorite things to do when I was playing docent in the gallery, as I sometimes did with visitors there, was to point out the differences as far as artifacts go between the Marvel work of roughly 1968 and then the DC work of 1973, which had been through fewer hands and was treated differently. So just in terms of the distressing of the pages, the material nature of the pages, you could really see a difference in how those pages had been treated over time. And it gave me and other docents an opportunity to talk about comic book production. Though I doubt that most people who came to the show dutifully read all 20 odd pages of that Thor story and all 20 odd pages of that Commandy story. Having them was instructive. They were actually in rear galleries. So if you look at the background, the deep background of this image, behind the dramatic Silver Surfer image is a gallery space where clockwise, all the pages from that Commandy comic from the early mid-70s were exhibited. And in the gallery adjacent to it, behind another wall, is where the Thor pages were. So as much as I encourage students and other visitors to really read those comics, I myself have a lot of difficulty standing in one place for a long time. In a gallery or museum setting, I tend to move around because my feet start to hurt, right? So I can empathize with the desire to take in a lot and then to circle round, to move quickly, and to have a navigable and kind of humanly relatable space that is not just about displaying production art, but is also about creating an experience for the user. Hence these enormous blow-ups or collages of vintage Kirby imagery that decorated different parts of the gallery. And all credit to gallery director Jim Sweeter for helping to brainstorm these and installing these and getting these into the space and doing simple things with primary colors that really work wonders, I have to say. So in both the Crumb exhibition that I visited and the Kirby exhibition that I curated, there were complete stories that might be read hypothetically by a very patient visitor to the galleries. But that still doesn't resolve the kind of tension that, for example, Damian, you discussed in your essay that's contained in the book. So I've been talking lately to my colleague, Ben Saunders, who's also an experienced curator. And some of you will know that he's the head of the curatorial team that assembled the Marvel Universe of Superheroes traveling exhibition that began about 3 years ago in Seattle and has been to several cities since then and is now on view in Chicago. And of course, Ben has curated a number of other comic art exhibitions at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum at the University of Oregon, including an EC exhibit in 2016, a Schultz Peanuts exhibit in 2012, and an exhibition of the history of the superhero comic in 2009. And he and I were talking about our experiences of the Kirby exhibition and of the Crumb Genesis exhibition recently. And we sort of both came to the conclusion that the Crumb Genesis exhibition was, no offense to anyone involved, an example of the wrong way to do it, or a less engaging way to do it. And we were thinking about, how does one borrow strategies from, for example, museums of science or museums of natural history that are concerned with user experience, with visitor experience? How do you do that? Now, both Ben and I, as English professors, are really interested in complete readable text, right? We bring that to the table, so we're interested in comics as text. But you have to do much more than put text or fragments of a text on a wall, I think, in order to engage people. And this is where some of the strategies that Damian refers to as new media concepts might come into play, of remixing, blowing up, adapting, and sort of aggressively providing a context. I shouldn't say aggressively, but assertively providing a context, which the Marvel Universe of Superheroes exhibit also does. I want to put in a brief plug for a forthcoming exhibition at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum at the University of Oregon, which is curated by Catherine Kelp-Stebbins. It's the Art of the News, or Comics Journalism, which will be up this fall at that museum. Ben Saunders has also been involved, but the curator here is Catherine Kelp-Stebbins, and this will feature work by artists like Joe Sacco and Sarah Glidden and many others. And it will include some digital installation stuff going on as well. So I'm told. So yeah, I've been thinking about, how do you provide a readable experience and at the same time provide a pleasurable gallery experience. I'll note that the superhero show that Ben Saunders curated had complete stories by, I think, Bob Fujitani, Will Eisner, Steve Ditko. The EC Comics exhibition had complete stories like Corpse on the Imgen by Harvey Kurtzman. You couldn't ask for better than that. But at the same time, it was enlivened by a bunch of other strategies. I never did get the reading corner I wanted in the Kirby exhibition, the reading installation where you would actually be readable books and you could sit down. We just didn't have the space. We asked for a lot, we got a lot, and we used our 3,000 square feet the best we could. But I was always hoping that there'd be a place where you could just sort of set a spell and also read these things in some facsimile of their original published form. So that maybe that says something about my nostalgia for old comic books, or maybe it says something about wanting to keep faith with the format for which this art was first made. I think it raises a lot of interesting issues. And as Ben Saunders and I were talking the other day, you know, the novelty is gone. So now we're thinking, what is the best, the optimal and most innovative ways to explain, to exhibit comics art? Because the novelty of it, thank goodness, is not so novel any longer. And now one can think about curatorial concepts and how to best kind of balance the presentation of, for example, production art with context, which I'm really looking forward to what kinds of answers people come up with to those questions in the future.
Charles,
Thank you.
If you think the Crumb exhibit by itself was a lot, I saw it in Seattle, and I wrote about this in the book also, as part of a overall exhibit of 500 years of illustration that started with like Rembrandt and Dürer and Goya and Picasso. And then after you had absorbed these 1,000 works from 500 years, then you would turn the corner and there was all of Genesis. So I don't think very many people made it past those pages on that as well. But and then the one thing that the museum curator at Seattle Art Museum observed, because I asked her, you know, like, was there any reticence about exhibiting cartoonists like Crumb in that context? She said absolutely not. She says that she thought that opened up the experience of this previous art to a new generation, and it also, you know, it obviously contextualized Crumb in an interesting way. And she said also, sales in the museum gift shop were never higher. That they sold like stacks and stacks of books, because people want comics. They want the stuff that they can read and not just look at the pictures and put on the shelf.
If I say that I'm sorry to interrupt, but if I say that the Crumb Genesis was the wrong way to do it, obviously that's kind of an obnoxious hot take, right? But it did wear people out. I was thinking about how Mouse Volume 2 was displayed at the Jewish Museum when I saw that happening. And Kim, you interviewed Art Spiegelman about the origins of that exhibit. And they did some great stuff with audio, like the voice of Vladek Spiegelman and other things in that space that really turned that around for me as a visitor.
Yeah, but actually, Spiegelman told me that he thought that doing all of Genesis was the wrong thing. He didn't really want to show all of Mouse either, but what do you leave out of that story? And he had all the pages. So it was this incredible light box in the middle of the exhibit. And he said that, I saw it in Toronto myself, and he said that the way that the exhibit is designed, you walk into the beginning of his career with like breakdowns and raw and everything, and you come on this huge light box, and then there's like New Yorker covers to like draw you into his like future career after Mouse, so that he can kind of like get out of the shadow of that. So it was interesting to me. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to him about it was I felt like that exhibit kind of showed the way that he felt about his career himself. And it was kind of a narrative in a narrative.
So I would like to wrap up this wide-ranging conversation with somebody whose career not only is personal associations with a lot of the artists that we've mentioned, has been a curator, has had his own work exhibited, has a historical perspective on all of this stuff. Denis, why don't you take us home with your thoughts and observations and some of your contributions to the
But I don't think I got the memo about supplying graphics, so I don't have any. Yeah, I come from more of a practical hands-on experience than all of the respected academics who have been talking here. I began my career in the late 60s as part of the underground comics movement. And at that time, comics in general were still pretty disreputable. There was very, very little respect for the medium, and even less so for the stuff my contemporaries were doing, because it was viewed as pornographic in some cases, misogynistic in some cases, just politically dangerous. And so it's been astonishing for me in a relatively short period of time to see comics go from no respect at all to being now in countless museums around the world. And so that just tells you how rapidly it's moving. In my own case, as a curator, I've focused mainly on a couple of key artists like Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman, and then the underground comics movement. And different iterations of those have taken place over the last 20 some years. Most recently, though, I was involved in another interesting twist, which was held at the Museum of Wisconsin Art, and it was on regional artists, which I think is another way to perhaps think about comic art. In this case, a number of artists either were born or lived in Wisconsin, more than you would think. And we also dipped down into Chicago and grabbed some Illinois artists too. And so I think that was the first time that's been done, according to Dan Nadell. I hadn't really thought about it before. And it encompassed not just the underground cartoonists, but the classic artists like Frank King and others who had come before, Claire Briggs, and so on. So I would say the lesson for me is making the comics accessible. I did not see the Spiegelman show. I wish I had, but I understand why the Crumb show was perhaps daunting. It's a lot, especially when you have to read all the so-and-so beget so-and-so, and it goes on and on forever, because it's quite literally the words of Genesis. But what I tried to do is not so much overwhelm viewers with complete stories. There were in some instances, but excerpts. So for example, with Will Eisner exhibit, we would certainly show at least one or two complete spirit stories, but then also really strong splash pages or really strong single interior pages. with graphic novels, with, for example, Life Force, I would take out the famous cockroach scene in the alley, kind of, I think, an 8-page segment that's quite powerful. And the same with Kurtzman. Charles mentioned Corpse on the Imogen. Of course, that's an all-time classic to show in any exhibit. But again, in the case of both Eisner and Kurtzman, they had such lengthy and varied careers that you really have to show kind of a genesis, so to speak, of their own careers. With the underground cartoonists, they're really quite a few. And so we were restricted then to a handful for each artist. But there we had the beginning of what I would call diversity in comics. It was the first time women were really welcome into comics with open arms, people of color, gay people. And so we tried to show that as part of just the whole political rebellion, not just against the culture, but against, in some ways, the comics that came before. My generation, for example, was inspired in a way by the Comic Code Authority that appeared in all those comic books we grew up with. And it was a symbol of censorship that we didn't really completely comprehend the reasons for until much later. But I remember growing up and thinking, the books that have that in the corner are not as interesting as the other ones that I was privy to. In other words, the pre-code comics I still was able to get in my neighborhood. And I saw that comics had been emasculated by that code, and I resented it deeply as a reader. When I became old enough to start doing comics myself on a professional level, I realized I shared that with my contemporaries. And so part of the whole underground comic movement was, in a sense, a reaction against the comics that were censored when we were young. And some would say some of us went too far, but that's another argument. So to get back to museums, I think comics are now over 100 years old. There's so many aspects to it, from the newspaper roots to the comic books, to comic strips, to newsstand comic books and undergrounds and all the independents and iterations since then. So I think what we're going to see going forward is a lot of specialized exhibits. It's a lot more challenging to have a survey because you really, of course, any curator can do it, but I think it's going to be perhaps more regional shows, more shows of an era. What Kim just did recently, just comics by women, and so on. So for me, as a cartoonist, a curator, someone who collects comic art and has loaned to shows that I had nothing to do with, it's just a really exciting time. And I would hope that those of us on the panel here who have some foot in that arena will see it even growing wider. And I think that'll mean more countries beyond North America and Europe. There's certainly, Japan loves comics, but they've been rather insular and not welcoming Western comics. Same with China and other places. I think there are territories to open up and also to import. And all of us should just be actively involved in all aspects of it. I couldn't be more excited about what's happening.
That is a great way to conclude. I think we all agree that we could talk about this. Certainly the seven of us could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but our appreciative audience that for you guys at Comic-Con at home might be hitting the pause button around now.
So Rob, can we put in a word for the Chicago exhibits that are coming this fall, since Dennis mentioned regional comics work?
Yeah, let's go around the horn and everybody tout one project or thing that you're excited about. You can start, Charles.
Okay, well, I'm not in any way involved in it. I'm only excited about it as a prospective visitor. So I want to be clear about that. But Dan Nadell has curated a show that's soon to open at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, which is Chicago Comics 1960s to Now. Sounds like it's going to be a really large scale and wide ranging exhibition. And there's a sort of companion exhibition curated by Chris Ware and Tim Samuelson at the Chicago Cultural Center, which is Chicago where comics came to life in 1880 to 1860. So these are pairs, like one up to 1960 and then the large exhibit at the MoCA covering Chicago comics since then. So it just seemed like
I love that the Midwest and the Northwest are as well represented in this conversation as New York and LA. That's a refreshing departure in the art world. Damian, do you have anything going on?
Yeah, well, I have Parable of the Sower, the graphic novel adaptation, is coming out in paperback next month, I think, in July. For those of you watching at home. So that's the most recent thing, and John and I are currently working on the sequel, Parable of the Talents, graphic novel adaptation. And also just John has this new imprint with Abrams Comic Arts called Megascope that looks at speculative fiction by and about people of color, especially African Americans. And all the work coming out of there, I really recommend people check out.
Exciting stuff. Diana, how about you?
On a personal level, I'm still working on my burgeoning graphic memoir, but as regards this particular topic, it's very gestational. But my colleague Barb Schultz and I are working with Minneapolis College of Art and Design on putting something on. One of the best things I did in the last 5 years was two sections of Justin Hall and Jennifer Camper's Queers in Comics conference. And I'd approached them about doing something similar in Minneapolis, and their response was, well, you can't use the name, but you can sure do something if you want. So we're having a dialogue about doing a regional Queers in Comics conference.
Great. And Eric, I know that you were here outside of your field speaking on behalf of your father. Is there anything in this space? You're muted. Unmute yourself, Eric.
Sorry, I would like to promote the Comic Studies Collaborative at San Diego State University. It's run by one of our librarians who's an incredible comic book curator. I mean, her exhibits are pretty amazing, and they're doing a lot of interesting stuff in San Diego State. So, and they're going to make comic books part of the core curriculum.
That is outstanding. And Kim, anything else? I know you've got all kinds of shows and stuff going on.
Women in Comics just opened in Rome, and there was a very interesting speaker series. Of course, it was all in Italian. So, but we were actually sponsored by the U.S. Embassy there. So you know that was really interesting. You know, working with them, like we came in like sort of at the end of the Trump era and watched the transition and also, I have a new book chapter that just came out in a book called The Art of Art Crumb, Underground in the Art Museum. I have obviously a chapter about exhibitions and also some of the controversies that happen when you show Crumb's older art. And I also profile 3 women that were influenced by him one way or the other, Trina Robbins and a couple of British artists. And of course, the book goes on, and I really appreciate all of you like finally getting together with us and talking about this. This has been a great discussion.
Outstanding. Dennis, anything on your radar?
Actually, I'm involved in a couple that just opened in 2 different places in Europe, both on Will Eisner. One in Dortmund, Germany, and one in Cherbourg, France. And both have exceptional catalogs, which is another thing we didn't touch on, but I love when a great catalog can be tied into an exhibit. So those who can't visit in person at least can see what was in the show. So that's a whole other topic.
I just ordered that Cherbourg catalog for the Eisner show. Yeah.
We should do a supplemental interview. So once again, my name is Rob Salkowitz. I write about this primarily on the business side, and I do a lot of stuff on comics art and the art market in Forbes and ICB2, sometimes in Publishers Weekly. This time next year, I hope to have at least one of my own book projects to be talking about, but that's for a later time. Thank you all. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Kim, for bringing us all together. Fantastic conversation, everybody. Hope you enjoy the rest of your virtual Comic-Con and see you in person real soon, I hope.
Thank you.